speaker is Joe Cook. Joe Cook from OA Digital and Surveying.
Yeah, Joe Cook from OA Digital. We're the consultancy arm of Oxford Archaeology. So I'm here with 7 different hats on, which is good because of the weather. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the business case for open source GIS, which is going to go over some of the stuff that Phil went over in his earlier. Sorry, that's me. Oh, right, okay. It's going to reiterate some of the stuff that Phil went over in his introductory talk this morning. So I may skip over a few little bits, but that will hopefully give us a bit more time for questions and things like that at the end. So here goes. So Phil briefly talked about what open source means. You don't have to be able to read this, but this is actually from the formal definition of open source software. So yeah, it's about free redistribution of your code. It's about being able to make derived works. It's about integrity of the open source code. But I think this is actually the most interesting part of the license from the user perspective. No discrimination against persons or groups. No discrimination against fields of endeavour. The license must not be specific to a product. The license must not restrict other software, and it must be technology neutral. So basically, open source licensing is all about fair use for software and about not being restricted. It's about enabling use rather than restricting it. Right, if we compare this to a very small fragment from the end user license agreement for a popular GIS package, Article 2, software, data, web services and documents are licensed and not sold. You do not buy software, you license it. Basically, the number and the type of bits of software that you use is entirely dictated by the license and by the amount of money that you pay. And finally, you can't alter it in any way. You can't unbundle various bits of this software for separate use. And I think this one's brilliant, right down at the bottom. After a reasonable transition period, licensee shall not use an earlier version of the software that the licensee has updated to a newer version. So even though you might need to use an earlier version of the software, you can't. I mean, you know, that's just nuts. You wouldn't put up with that if it was about a car, you know, you can't use an earlier type of tyre or something like that, you know. So why do we put up with it for software? So, as I say, there's a little bit of a dichotomy there. And quite often, open source software is treated with a certain amount of hysteria or fear, uncertainty and doubt by the proprietary software market. And these are genuine quotes. Linux is a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. That was from Steve Ballmer of Microsoft. Jack Dangermond of ESRI basically likes to imply that, you know, it's a little bit dodgy. You don't want to use open source software in life or death situations. You know, do you want an ambulance dispatch system running on a system that's not as well supported? Well, personally, I want an ambulance dispatch system that works. You know, that's the key point, isn't it? So, basically, when you're faced as an end user with people trying to sell you software, or rather license you software, you know, you've got to be able to actually accept what they're saying with a pinch of salt. And I think, to be fair, that's true on both sides of the equation, open source and proprietary. I'm not going to deny it otherwise. So, as end users, I'd have thought that these 3 factors are pretty important when it comes to making decisions about software purchases. Fitness for purpose, does it actually do the job? Value for money, and, you know, a certain amount of risk. You want a low-risk product. So, we've already gone over some of the concerns about open source software that, as I say, that Phil discussed earlier. This is the results of a survey in 2009 to the barriers against open source adoption in local government. And you'll see that the two biggest barriers were lack of awareness and risk. So it's good to see so many people here, because that's obviously dealing with the lack of awareness perspective. It's nice to see that security concerns and support are actually fairly low down the list of concerns, really. So, how do we mitigate against risk? In the open source geospatial space, it's the same as the wider open source space, really. Sustainable projects with a large user and developer community. The point about having a large user base is that chances are somebody else has come across the same problems that you might have. So you might not even have to go to the developers to get a fix, because somebody out there will probably have solved exactly the same problem and will be more than happy to help you with it. Having access to a large developer community obviously gives you a much more robust, sustainable release cycle for your product. Chances of getting bugs patched are much, much greater. So, in specific terms, I would suggest that the way forward for open source GIS is to go for products that are supported by the Open Source Geospatial Foundation. Now, I'm going to go into that into the general foundation in slightly more detail at the end of this. But basically, the foundation has what's called a project incubation procedure. Now, what that basically says is that to become a genuine OSGeo supported project, you have to prove that you are obeying the open source license, that you have intellectual property rights over every single line of your code, that you have a proper project steering group, that you have a proper release cycle, that you have a big community of people. So it is designed to provide a totally sustainable project. OSGeo will then help you by providing you the resources to actually host this project. So that's mailing lists, bug trackers, version control, software for distributing new versions of your code. Basically, all of the infrastructure that you might require to have your project hosted. OSGeo will supply that, and also will give the project, kudos, raise the profile of it, and generally, basically, help promote it. But also, there is a website called OHLOH, O-H-L-O-H, which actually tries to sort of give you a kind of monetary value for open source projects, and it will tell you what code it's written in, is it considered to be mature relative to other open source projects, does it have a large user base, what sort of license has it got, and it will tell you about roughly the number of man hours that's gone into development and how much that's really worth in time. So basically, by looking at OSGeo incubated projects, by looking at OHLOH, you can make an informed decision about the software. So basically, you can mitigate the risk, you can minimise your risk by choosing projects that are totally sustainable. So, value for money. As Phil mentioned earlier, there's a lot of things that are always going to cost you money, regardless of whether the software does. You're always going to have hardware costs, training, maintenance and support costs. Nobody's denying that. That's nothing to do with the software license. But when you're talking about proprietary software, you have to add in these additional costs. So entry and exit costs for being tied into a particular package. Perhaps you're on one of these lovely 3-year deals where you'll actually have to pay a penalty clause to get out of it. Volume licensing. So you're lucky and you have to expand your business, and suddenly you've got to pay an extra vast amounts of money for more software. Those are all things that you have to consider. And with open source software, we are really reduced to these 4 key points. As I say, these are all things that are not talking about licenses.